Welcome back to Dave and Mickey's Shiny Side Out. This is number 461, 116, 400. That's crazy. And we are, in fact, talking today to an awesome guest in just a moment. We finished the first hour with news and discussions, etc., etc. Now, without further ado, let's get to our guest, Dave.
Yeah, look, George Simpson is a renowned investigator. I fell into contact with George when he actually rang me, believe it or not, all those years ago now, and I've found George's work to be precise, exciting, and he gets to the bottom of the story, and he won't take lame examples of evidence as evidence. It's got to be real. It's got to be factual. And for that, I respect him. George, welcome to Shiny Side Out with Dave and Mickey.
Okay, any feedback on my side here? My Skype is completely alien. It's all changed.
It has all changed.
Since I've used it. But anyway, sounds like we're working. Yep.
Yeah, you are coming through loud and clear.
Oh, that's great. Good.
Oh, wow. So I remember that first call, and that was around about the time of MH370, if I'm not wrong.
Or maybe even before.
It was only slightly before, I think, right, or thereabouts. Yeah. And that when we had the call, and then I found out about MH370, I didn't put the two together, but I thought it was a sign, and it was a sign, that this is there's something going on, something here. And from that moment forward, outside of my book release, I found, and my own life experience, I found that there is a willing set of people who are open to research, certainly in the paranormal, but specifically within the UFO community, and for that matter, willing and able to put a sentence together, probably unlike I'm doing right now. So, having said that, let's just take it back to when you first got into UFOs through research.
Well, okay.
Just to give the audience an idea.
You know about the Knowles case that happened in Mundrabilla in Western Australia, late 1980s.
Was that the crossing, the family in the car crossing the Nullarbor?
Yeah, crossing the Nullarbor.
That's
and
right.
their car, they saw the strange light over the road, and it actually lifted their car up off the road, mm-hmm. and then let go of them and dropped them in their car back onto the road.
Wow.
Pretty scary kind of a thing. Well, around the time that happened, a gentleman wrote in a letter to the newspaper and said, look, this just shows you these UFOs haven't gone away. They're still around, and it's a real thing that people experience. And this guy wrote to the newspaper, and he left his name and his suburb at the bottom of the letter, and I looked him up in the phone book and rang him up, got talking to him. He was an elderly guy called George Bond. And we had a bit of a chat. He was from Sandringham. And he said, look, if you're so interested in the UFO subject, why don't you go and join the Victorian UFO Research Society, which was still running in those days. He was an ex-member. He hadn't been for years, but he was encouraging me to go along. And so I did. And I started going to their meetings, which they held 4 times a year. And that's how I got got into the research side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my first meetings, I went along there. I very soon on, after going to those meetings, I recognised Guido Valentich. So I'd seen photos of him in the newspaper, and he was going to their meetings. Yeah, so I got to actually sit down and talk to Guido Valentich, which was pretty amazing, because he was going along looking for answers to the Valentich case, and that's probably one of the major cases that's happened in Australia. One of the greatest aviation mysteries. About 8 or 9 years ago, I was invited to go and talk about UFOs on the RMIT radio station They have their own like internal radio station in the university at RMIT.
Mm-hmm.
They invited me to go and talk about UFOs, and the young guys there had never heard of the Valentich case, and I couldn't believe it. So I gave them a quick rundown on that show, what had happened to Frederick Valentich, and how he disappeared, and how the last thing he said was that there was a strange object flying around him,
Mm-hmm.
and then he and his plane disappeared, and they said, "Oh, spooky." Well, it's more than spooky.
Yeah, that's right.
It's an amazing case. But yeah, and I've been interested in UFO stuff since I was in primary school. Reading UFO books that they had in the school library when I was in primary school. So I've had an interest in the subject for many, many years. And going to the UFO meetings in the city, I got to meet all the other people that went to the meetings. Then I learned about the Westall case then.
That's the school in Melbourne, everyone.
The school case in Melbourne, which was very like the one that happened in Africa that
Yes.
people might know of, in Rua, I think it's called. So there was a big similarity between those two cases. It's a really strange thing. It turns out that my cousin is married to one of the Westall witnesses, who was not at the school but working in the market garden across the road from the school,
Oh,
and saw the thing. And he's been married to my cousin for like 40 years,
Huh.
and he's never mentioned the fact that he'd ever seen a UFO, and I never mentioned the fact that I was involved in UFO research. And when Rosie Jones made that documentary, the one called Westall 66, because I'd helped her with a bit of the research, she sent me a copy of the disc. I sat down and watched the show, and there's Paul Smith in the documentary, and I couldn't believe it. So I rang him up, and he didn't know I was into research, and I didn't know that he was one of the witnesses. So there you go.
oh, that's crazy how small the world is.
Yeah, and when Valentich disappeared, I actually saw Valentich's plane fly over my street as he was heading into the setting sun the day he disappeared. So
Wow.
that's just a crazy coincidence.
Well, while just for everyone's sake here, just this week, things happen across my Facebook or social media feeds, and I ran into that audio there was an interview with a friend of the farmer who had the sighting, and it was an audio recording.
Yep.
Why don't you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, can you actually play that as part of this show? Or some of it?
I'm not sure that I can.
And why would that be?
Because I can't put audio back into Skype for people to hear it. Oddly enough.
Yeah, it's a Skype limitation.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I put it up on my own Facebook, on my own YouTube channel a while ago. I think it should still be there. If not, I'll do something about that. What happened was in the mid to late 1990s, a lot of UFO reports started coming in New South Wales, and Bill Chalker was getting a lot of reports.
Yes.
Everybody knows Bill Chalker is probably Australia's best known UFO researcher worldwide. He's pretty well known.
Mm-hmm.
And he got a friend of his called Rob Tilley. They got together and decided to go to the area, the hotspot area where all these reports were coming from. They were coming from Coonabarabran. So he went there and he took his tape recorder with him, and they met a whole lot of eyewitnesses that had these strange objects that were flying around their houses and stuff. All sorts of weird cases going on. But just about everyone they spoke to said, have you spoken to Laurie? Why don't you go and talk to Laurie? You should go and talk to Laurie. Laurie who? Well, this guy called Laurie Ryder. He ran the hardware store in Coonabarabran. So they've gone along to meet up with Laurie Ryder. They've rung him up first, and then they've gone along and met him. And that's what you heard was Laurie Ryder talking on the tape.
Mm-hmm.
That was recorded by Bill Chalker.
Oh, right.
Right. So that
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. Now, one day, some years ago, when we did this I got contacted by the Science Channel, wanted to do a documentary series, a new series called The Unexplained Files.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to include the Valentich story. They ended up making it the first episode in the first show of the first series, the Valentich case, and they decided to kind of reenact the case and to
I saw
talk to
that
all the
documentary
witnesses and follow
that they did.
where it
Yep.
went. Yeah, and they came to my house and filmed me, and we filmed for over 3 days. That was back in 2013. Now, after that went to air and Bill Chalker saw it, there was something at the end that triggered a memory in his mind.
Mm-hmm.
And he remembered the fact that he'd been to Coonabarabran many years before, and that he'd interviewed this lorry rider guy. And Bill rang me and said, "Have I ever told you about this case from New South Wales that might have some connection to the Valentich case?" And I said, "No, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, there was a witness who saw a huge circular object hovering above his farm, and he thought there was either an aircraft or the wing of an aircraft stuck onto the side of it. And he could read the registration number, the aircraft registration." I said, "No, you never told me about that." So he began to tell me the whole story. And then he played over the phone to me, he played that tape. He eventually sent me a copy of the tape, and I managed to clean it up a bit. And it's a really interesting story because he told me that he'd gone to Coonabarabran and spoken to all these people about this UFO flap that was going on, all these cases going on in the mid-90s. But when he was talking to what this guy lorry rider did was he ran the hardware store at Coonabarabran, and it's a country area, isn't it? It's a big country town.
That's right.
And he loved talking to his customers about all kinds of things, and especially he would ask them if they'd ever had any UFO sightings. And if they did, he'd write it down in a journal. That was kind of a hobby.
So
he had a whole stack of UFO reports.
That's great.
That he collected over his retail career. And he was a motorcycle enthusiast. He loved motorbikes. Just a fascinating guy. And he told this long, very, very detailed story about how he had all these UFO reports everywhere. He said there was a whole mixed bag of them. He said, but by far the most interesting story he'd ever heard was this farmer that came into his shop one day and reported that he used to be living down in South Australia, somewhere in the Riverina area, somewhere along near Keith, in South Australia. And he said that it was a Sunday morning and he was baling some lucerne, which is a plant they grow for feeding the livestock feed, called lucerne. And he had a tractor and he had a harvesting unit on the back that was making hay bales out of this lucerne. And I'm not sure what that actually looks like. We had a lucerne tree when we did, but I'm not sure what this stock feed.
No, it's sort of like it looks like a tall, skinny weed, and it has like flower buds, but the whole plant is entirely edible, and it has such a short growth life that they cut it and roll it up and dry it so it can last longer through longer seasons. Right.
Well, this farmer said that he was busily doing his job, baling this stuff, and all of a sudden he heard this noise, and he thought it was one of the bearings in the equipment behind the trailer, behind the tractor, the hay baling machine. He heard this noise like a faulty bearing.
Yeah, right.
And he thought there was something wrong with the hay baler, and it runs off the tractor engine. So he uncoupled it. There's like a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, mechanically uncouple it. Well, if you do that, the noise should stop. Right?
Yeah.
But he said, but the noise continued. He couldn't believe it. He jumped off the tractor. And he was having a look, and he was trying to figure out how come he could still hear this noise, because he just disconnected it. And then he got the sense that he was in a shadow, and he looked up and he realised there was a big circular thing hovering above him. That's where the noise was coming from. And because he's a farmer and he does his own crop dusting, he figured that this big object hovering above him was travelling too slowly to remain airborne. That's based on our understanding of aeronautics.
Yeah, the unusual flight characteristics. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's got very, very frightened that there's this thing hovering above him that could crash down on him at any moment. So he thinks. So he's run out to the side to get up clear of the edge of this thing. So in case it drops, it's not going to drop on him, right?
Mm-hmm.
This common sense survival technique, you know.
Run away. Run away from it. Yep.
He's run away sideways, and when he's got sideways, he can see the edge of this object, and he can see what the size of it, and comparing it to the size of his tractor and the baler together, he reckons it must have been about 90 feet in diameter. That's about 30 metres.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty big object. And he said from the side he could see it had a dome on top, and it looked like a doorway in the dome, but there were no handles or anything. He said it looked like there was a seam around the bottom of this dome on the top.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, and then he noticed, he gave a very detailed description of a lot of things.
He did in that audio.
Yeah. And then he said, then he could see there was it looked like an aircraft was actually stuck to the side of this object. And at that point, Bill's tape ran out.
Oh.
So Bill's had to flip the cassette to side B and then press record again. The
fellow would have still been talking.
Yeah, and Laurie, he never stopped talking. This guy talked a lot. Anyway, he said that the aircraft, the wings, the top of the aircraft, the back of the wings, on the top side of the wings,
because it's a Cessna.
It was stuck to the side of this circular object with the tail hanging down in the engine at the top.
Right.
So the wheels would have been sticking out.
Yeah.
And because of that, he could see the registration number of the plane on the wing. And so he didn't forget it. He scratched it into his tractor with a nail, so he wouldn't forget what the registration number was. And he said the most important thing about this was that this happened the morning after the day that Fred disappeared, heading down to King Island. So this was the next morning, but in Adelaide.
And of course, he didn't know any of that stuff.
He didn't know at the time.
That's right.
But the farmer didn't know that Fred had disappeared. That hadn't been in the news yet.
Yeah.
But Laurie Ryder heard the story like 10 years later, after it all happened. But the farmer had remembered it. Now, the farmer may have given his name, but Laurie didn't say the name. And so we don't have a starting point. We cannot even begin to find out who this farmer was because we don't know. And it's because of that ridicule factor that everybody has this fear of ridicule. If you say you've seen a UFO, they just laugh at you.
Yeah. If
you say you've seen a UFO with an airplane stuck to the side of it,
that's got to be a multiplier for ridicule.
Well, see, that's sort of because Bill has studied UFOs for many years. He's never heard of a case like that before, and so he just thought it was so ridiculous. He just basically shelved it and never mentioned it. And after he saw this TV show that I was on, and then at the end, Dr. Haynes, the NASA scientist, saying this funny noise at the end of the vintage tape, that the metallic sound, could be the sound of the aircraft coming into contact with this unusual object in the air. And that's completely what rang the bell with Bill, that he hadn't said anything about this follow-up story. It's very, very interesting.
So, George, the serial number or the registration of the plane, in that audio, he says that he noted it down in his logbook back at his shop.
Yeah, that was where he had kept all these UFO stories from all the customers. Yep.
But the guy doesn't own that shop anymore. What happened to Laurie then?
Look, Laurie died about 10 years ago. Unfortunately, I've been in contact with his son, who's on Facebook, he says he hadn't heard about the story, didn't know anything about it. And Laurie had a brother who was a very old school guy, doesn't want to talk to anyone about anything either.
Of course, of course.
And apparently Laurie had a daughter, and she's very, very hard to communicate with. But I've tried a whole lot of things to try to track it down, to try to find out who the farmer was, and nobody seems to know or remember. It's very, very hard when you don't have a name to go on. You can't really start. You can't begin. I'd love to find the tractor and get a photograph of the tractor with the scratch mark where the number was scratched into the tractor.
Absolutely.
But it was the same. I'd love to interview the farmer if he's still alive, or one of his family members if they're, hopefully he's got kids or.
Well, you could imagine that they moved to Coonabarabran, right, from Adelaide, and they weren't simply travelling through. That would be a good hope.
Well, yeah, he said the guy had an ag bike. He got off this little ag bike.
Oh, that means he's definitely.
He laughed about that. He said, "Yeah, a little ag bike. They sound like sewing machines."
Yeah.
And then he says, "Yeah, I should never have sold the Vincent." Well, it's too late now. He's a bit of a motorbike enthusiast.
Yeah. But wow.
He didn't say the name of who the farmer was. This farmer had been down in the Riverina area. Now, we do know the actual suburb in Adelaide where the farmer was when this happened, and we haven't released it.
Yeah, good.
For a very good reason.
Twofold. Number one, when the person is found, it's a way of being able to distinguish the truth.
Yeah.
Right, from someone just making a story up, pretending to be the farmer. And the other is to keep their information private.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is, he doesn't live down there anymore.
Yeah.
So that isn't really a problem. But look, because we've kept that secret, it's created another little interesting anomaly.
How so?
One of the things, because with any case that's this old, errors creep into the story. And then once an error gets established, it gets repeated and repeated, and it becomes fact, even though it's not a fact. And that's a real problem. Now, one good example is a friend of mine sent me this magazine, Plane and Pilot magazine, from November 2020. So it's a very highly regarded aircraft magazine. This friend of mine's in aviation. And on page 10, Mysteries of Flight, Alien Abduction or Pilot Error by Desiree Kokis.
Oh.
And she has written that that Fred was probably flying upside down and went into the water and all those theories.
Yeah.
So all of the errors are in here, and she just goes along with all of the errors. And she says that there was this farmer who, strange disappearance, this farmer saw an object with the plane stuck to the side of it, and she has written that the farmer was somewhere in Cape Otway, which has never
been confirmed or denied.
Laurie never said that. And so I was starting to get reports from people saying, "Oh, we heard that somebody else saw the plane stuck to the UFO and it was over in Cape Otway." But where is this coming from? It's coming from this article that this person has written. It's got all these errors in it.
Yeah,
so anyway, look, for years these errors have been creeping into the story. One was that Fred was flying a routine cargo flight.
Oh.
Well, hang on, there was nothing routine about it.
I thought it was picking up crayfish or something, wasn't
it? It was not a routine cargo flight. Some of them have even said that Fred was going to pick up fish.
Yeah.
For a fish, because he worked in a fish market.
What?
That's the first Fred's heard of it. Fred never worked in a fish market. He was working in a hardware store in Melbourne, in Moonee Ponds. He had nothing to do with a fish market. So these stories get out, and then they become repeated, and then they almost become fact. Somebody said to me a few years ago, "Look, George, you should write a book about this." And so for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been writing.
Oh, good.
And trying to set the record straight. I'm trying to discredit all of these crazy theories. I mean, first of all, aviation friends of mine have told me there's nothing routine about flying a single-engine plane over Bass Strait when the sun is setting and being alone. You just don't do that. If you're going over the sea, you go in a twin-engine plane.
Yep.
You don't hire a single-engine plane. You have a twin-engine plane, and you have a number of people with you. You don't go alone.
Yeah, right. So you get a Bonanza, right, rather than a Cessna.
Yeah. All sorts of things you can do. There are some things you just don't do. And that was the only odd thing about Fred, was that he did go by himself. In fact, he was planning to take his girlfriend Rhonda, he took her up a lot in the plane, and she even said on that TV program called Something Shining that SBS made many years ago in the early 90s. She said that Fred used to do acrobatic tricks and to show her how well he could fly. She'd be sitting in the aircraft next to him.
Yeah, wow.
And he'd do these flip over rolls and things and scare the pants off her, you know. So he was actually not an incompetent pilot, but all the skeptics would make you think that it was his own fault because he was a bad pilot on all these things. So I thought, I'm sick of hearing all this. Bugger this. We're going to have to set the record straight because Fred's not really doing it himself, is he? So
yeah, that's true.
Time to go and bat for Fred, which is what I've been trying to do. So
that'd be a good book title.
Going to bat for Fred. Yeah. What I've been thinking of calling the book is Nothing on Radar.
Nice.
Or as a subtitle, perhaps. You know, Valenti's Mystery, Nothing on Radar. Because I did get to hear the audio tape at one stage, and Fred, while Fred was talking to Steve Roby, in the background you could hear the guys in that same room contacting the radar guys and asking them, have you got anything on radar? And you hear the guy saying, no, there's nothing down there at all on radar. He said, I've got a few returns from a bit further north than that, but nothing that you would say was an aircraft.
Yeah, right.
So they were actually checking out while it was happening that there was no radar returns coming from either Fred's plane or this object that was flying around him. And another interesting point about Fred's encounter, he was giving pretty clear descriptions of what was happening around him. And every time they've reenacted it and they've got actors to say the lines that Fred said, and they're in the transcript, they've always got it wrong.
Oh.
They don't understand. They don't really see. They don't understand what Fred's trying to say. What Fred actually says was, it's passing over me. And this is what he says. He says, it's passing over me at 2-3 times at a time at speeds I cannot identify.
Wow.
Now, just try to think about that. What kind of an aeroplane or what kind of an aircraft or what sort of an object can pass over you at 2 to 3 times at a time and do it so quickly that you can't tell what it is? And he said it was large. It was a very large object.
Wow. So
it's like it appears like multiple objects going across when it goes over you. Now, you know what that reminds me of? Something that Bob Lazar said was that these things, because they have a gravitational field,
they bend space-time, right?
Well, yeah, because of the gravitational field, they have that gravity can bend light.
And that could have been gravitational lensing.
Yeah, so you're getting kind of this very strange optical effect. It could just be an optical illusion, but he was reporting it. The other thing was too, as he was speaking, there was a sound in the background. It was like a radio interference. It's like you can hear me speaking clearly, but if I had an industrial sewing machine sitting next to me and my wife was doing some sewing, which she does a lot, and it was running an industrial machine running at high speed, a continuous noise, you'd hear that coming over. The sound like that was coming through when Fred spoke. Now, there was a lot of other planes in the air at the same time of day, and every time they spoke, the radio was clear.
Ah, right.
And we know it wasn't a faulty radio. The plane had only been serviced that morning, and everything had been checked, and everything was fine. So it was the radio was doing what it was meant to do, and it was picking up this interference.
Look, I understand, because I think we've all used magnetic microphones and had an electronic source near it. Like if you had a mobile phone, it can interfere with it. If you have, because it wasn't the word then, machinery, yes, electromagnetic waves can alter the signal's path. Yeah. Gravity can. And look, it's something. I believe, I remember, I've only ever heard the copy or the reenactment of that. I've never heard the original.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And you also mentioned that it was a metallic scraping at the end.
Yeah, they've used that in the documentary in season 1 and episode 1 of the Unexplained Files.
Mm-hmm.
That metallic sound you see Dr. Haynes put this cassette in and press play.
Mm-hmm.
That is the actual tape. That is the actual sound. It's the real one. So, and that's on YouTube. You can look up Valentage metallic sound.
Files.
Yeah, Valentage, the metallic sound. It's a strange metallic sound like you get. I mean, you've got to. He just reported that his aircraft engine was running at 2,300 RPM,
mm-hmm.
which is flight, full cruise speed, engine speed for flying.
Yeah.
And he just reported that he was at 4,500 feet. And then he's been cut off mid-sentence. And then there's this noise with no delay from when he was talking to when the noise started.
Yeah.
Like half a second or something delay, no, hardly any delay. So all of a sudden, I think his aircraft's probably been caught up into the magnetic field.
Yeah.
And they've collided in mid-air, I think.
According to Peter Hellier from the Canadian Defence Minister for 4 years, or 3 years, up to 1967.
Yep.
He mentioned some unsuccessful flights of military aircraft getting too close to their propulsion and it failing their very tightly tuned military spec, gain for lightness example of what an aircraft wing is, and it played havoc with them. A Cessna, low-fi, low-tech, that could possibly have been able to survive, I'm postulating, but it could survive that, maybe outer thing, or maybe it could be unintentional or intentional on the part of the pilot of the other object.
Well, from what I've been able to gather, I would think that it most likely would have been unintentional and accidental, like they just accidentally got too close to each other. But I don't know. I could be wrong. I'm just thinking that's
and then it flew around for a day and didn't kind of recognise that the thing was there. Right?
Well, it seems to be, yeah. The pilot, the guy, the farmer that saw it was the next morning. Now, the other part of this farmer's story ends up a bit strangely. Not that none of this is strange anyway. But, Laurie goes on to say, look, that day, later on that day, the farmer saw this thing flying off, still making this screaming sound, of this screaming bearing sound as it flew off. It went over towards an area down there where they were doing some military manoeuvres down there near the Murray River. So, they went off, and that was the last he saw of it. He said, but that afternoon he went shopping. The farmer went out to the local shops, and his neighbour saw him and said, "Oh, g'day, Laurie." He said, "I see you've been doing some more crop spreading." Now, and he said, "No." And he said, yeah, I saw the Cessna down in your top paddock this morning. He said, no, there's no plane there's no Cessna in my top paddock. And the farmer said, "Yes, there is. I saw it this morning. I was down there." He said, "I was down there and I seen it. I seen this plane." Okay. So he's gone back home. He said, "That's interesting. I'll go down and have a look when I get home." And he had to go through several locked gates to get down to they have airstrips at the end of their properties so they can take off and land and do their crop spraying and all that stuff, But he said crop spreading. I don't know what he meant. Anyway, that's what he said. And so he's gone down. He said he went down there. He didn't see any plane down there, but there were fresh tyre marks on the ground from a plane. And he said he followed the tracks, and at the end there was a pool of sump oil on the ground. So that was the last part of this farmer's story. And they also said that there was oil running down the outside of the plane when he saw it stuck to the side of this object.
Oh, it would have played havoc with the engine.
Look, it gets even weirder. I wrote this story up and put it in the Ufologist magazine, and I got a call back from one of the readers. He emailed me, one of the readers, and said, "Look, listen, my parents told me they were watching a TV show, and they said that they couldn't remember if it was the Willesee show or the Don Lane show.
Yes.
But there was some guy who was an American official of some kind, like a military official or somebody in American government or something, was over here with his wife.
A uniformed fellow.
And he was going to go on TV and tell everybody that we had a right to know what had actually happened to Fred Valentich. And we now know who this guy was, but we didn't. I managed to find out who he was because I got in contact with one of the ex-producers of the Don Lane show. And I got onto Channel 9. I was trying to get an episode to find out of who this visiting guy was and what he said about the Valentich case. And they said they didn't know anything about it. I'd need to know the date of the show.
Yeah, the show number, pretty much.
And I'd have to know who the guy was, who was the guest. And we didn't know who that was. This guy's parents couldn't remember who it was. But this guy said he would only go on TV if he had an armed escort to get from his hotel room for him and his wife to get to Channel 9. He'd go on TV, tell us this amazing information that we had a right to know about as Australians, and then they'd have an armed escort back to Melbourne Airport. They'd jump on a plane and go to America.
Wow. Before anyone knew about it.
Well, all of this stuff about the armed escort and everything was just to generate viewers, to get the ratings up. Right? These guys know what they're doing. And the story was a whole lot of hogwash. The story was that over at Pine Gap, in the American base, they have these electromagnetic drones that run on electromagnetism, and they're big drones and little ones, and they can fly them by remote control, and they can go anywhere in the world and do surveillance. That's the story that he said. And he said, and one day the big one came back with an aeroplane stuck to the side of it. And that was interesting to me because I've only ever heard of this farmer saying that there was a plane stuck to the side of a circular craft. And here's somebody else saying there was a plane stuck to the side of it. That's interesting. Anyway, he said, and the pilot was okay. He was alive and he was in there. And it was Frederick Valentich, this guy said. He said, but now he knows too much because it's a top secret program, so he's not allowed to speak to his family or make any contact with his family or anybody else in the outside world. He'll have everything he ever needs, and he's now part of the program, a valuable part of their program up there at Pine Gap, and we don't have to worry about UFOs or aliens abducting people or anything because it was just an accident and it was something that happened when they're
settle the nation down, right?
Well, guess who this guy turned out to be?
Who?
It was Gordon Liddy.
No way.
Right? I got in contact with one of the producers of the show, and they said, yeah, Gordon Liddy came on and did that. He did this, had this armed escort to and from the TV station. He's the guy that one of the guys that broke into the Watergate Hotel.
That's right.
And he's a CIA guy.
I knew the name.
He is CIA. So why are the Americans sending a CIA guy over here to tell us that Fred was not picked up by a UFO? Why?
Because clearly the UFO story wasn't fake enough, right? So don't believe that one. Hey, believe it was just our own tech. Don't worry about it.
Well, that's really, that tells me, that speaks volumes, you know.
It means
and the fact that
so much more.
Gordon Liddy, yeah. But I can't prove that because look, yeah, I've got somebody saying yeah, it was him. But I got back in contact with the archives people at Channel 9 that had been very, very helpful and cooperative with me when I didn't know who it was I was searching for. And then when I said, I'm looking for, I'd like to see a program when Gordon Liddy was on. And they said, no, Gordon Liddy was never on that show. The producers remember him being on the show, but Channel 9 archives are saying, no, there's no episodes of Gordon Liddy on it. No. You must be thinking of somebody else.
Oh, goodness.
And also, they said, look, he might have been on, according to our records, he might have been on one of the Willesee programs, because Willesee did those current affairs programs.
That's right.
And now they said, but we don't have the rights or access to any of the Willesee shows because they all belong to Willesee. And now it's the Willesee estate because Willesee died of cancer a couple of years ago. And so there's another dead end.
Well, Gordon Liddy's still alive.
Yeah,
He's 90.
He had his own radio. Is he?
Yeah.
He had his own radio show for years in America.
Could you imagine contacting him and say, was it you?
Yeah, well, I haven't even thought of that. I should try. I should see if I can find him on Facebook.
Yeah, right.
But it could be somebody staging themselves.
Yeah, as him.
Yeah,
I get that. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, look, that is an interesting story. But it's going to be in my book as well. So all the details about that.
Oh, that's awesome. Do you know, while we're talking, the world's changed since then, since 1978.
Completely.
And there's so many documents and things that are being released, and some governments have already openly admitted that they exist. I think Russia was the first to say, that it's all real. But whether or not that was only propaganda or not, I'm not quite sure. Then, South American governments, Mexican government, pardon me. Then the big one, the Tic Tac UFO, all the freedom of information stuff that I've downloaded and looked at is so heavily redacted you can barely make a sentence out.
Oh, really?
Oh no! Even in the latest batch this week that I've downloaded, and it's kind of disappointing. But you can make out their discussion. They're talking about something, but and every once in a while the word UFO comes up, and that's pretty much all you get. But the big world-changing event for me in the UFO field has been the release of the Tic-Tac-Toe and David Fravor's, information that he's brought forward, and he's been willing to talk about it, about being on a training mission off California coast and being ordered once they're in the air, rather than doing their thing, they were sent to a specific location offshore to investigate something, and they did. And they found, of the I think the 4 planes, 2 went in a different direction. They went to the object. 1 stayed at altitude, and the other one, David Fravor's plane, he flew down to examine the object. And it's described as a Tic Tac. Everyone should know this.
Yep.
The fact that then they admitted to it occurring several times, and it was just a known thing that these things pop up and down and do their thing at will, and without any intervention from humans. And in fact, they tried just to, since they know the schedule, try to stay away from it. Doesn't it? I have to admit that I think that's the game changer, that we have now the US military telling us, hey, here's this thing. We probably do know what it is, but we're not going to tell you. But look, here's the thing. If you just get over it. Understand that there's obviously life on the Earth, sharing the Earth with us, or they're just temporary visitors. I don't know. And I have to speculate from that point. Do you think the world's changed because of that admission?
Well, it's hard to find any evidence of it, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people didn't even notice that it was on the news. And I saw the reports on the news.
Yeah.
When it happened, a lot of people missed it. It went in one ear and out the other for a lot of people. And it got repeated a few times because every few months they bring out another film, because the guys that was doing it was bringing out more and more. That new documentary that came out called Phenomenon, the new James Fox film, goes into it in quite a lot of detail, and it's got interviews with David Fravor in there too.
Oh, awesome!
And he's been on the Joe Rogan show as well. So, pretty amazing stuff. It is world changing because it means that it's not, the UFO subject is no longer a matter of ridicule. It's no longer something that's not taken seriously by scientists, because it's now been admitted that scientists are taking it seriously and they are studying it, and they have been for years, and they've been denying it for years, but now the cat's out of the bag. So
you go on.
That is very, very interesting.
Can I ask you, George?
Go on.
Last year, I watched a program with great interest. I can't remember which channel it was. I must lie, but it was called the Skinwalker Ranch. Right?
Oh, right, yeah.
A real estate gentleman had bought it. I think he was a Mormon,
So Becky just asked me a question about that. Yeah. Look, that is a very, very amazing thing. That even gets a mention in the new Bob Lazar film, because George Knapp talks about that, because he went out there and investigated it.
Yeah.
And it's some really weird stuff been going on there, and that's all part of the same package. It's weird stuff that's been going on and people have been denying for years, but fascinating stuff.
Yeah, the amazing thing is, and this was I think in the last episode when we watched it, and I'm really burning to see the second season. Hopefully it's going to be produced. But they found about 1 kilometer off the ground, they found this anomaly. That's where the anomaly seems to originate. So it wasn't from the ground. It wasn't from anywhere on the earth. It was actually in the middle of the sky that they triangulated this odd anomaly signal to come from, as well as where they then actually took footage of the UFO itself.
Right.
I think when I watched it, I thought, my goodness, are we close to disclosure here now? I can't believe they're actually showing this on TV.
Yeah, right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, look, you had this famous billionaire who bought the ranch, Bigelow, right. Robert Bigelow, and he was trying to get to the bottom of it. And in the end, all of the American authorities and all American military people were sending all of their UFO reports and everything to Bigelow, because he became kind of the expert on this weird stuff that's been going on. But just also another interesting thing about the about this Tic Tac thing, and the thing that Commander Fravor had been involved in. All that stuff was involving Navy, the major Navy battleships and things, nuclear-powered ships that the Navy have. Well, way back in 1989 when Dr. Haynes came out here. He'd written a book about the Valenti's case, and he came to go over talk about that case and other things at Moorabbin Airport. And the Valenti's family went along to that. But the very next night, they had a special meeting in Viewforce, and because I was on the committee, and I audio recorded both Haynes's talk and what went on the next night, a special meeting held at Viewforce headquarters, and where Haynes told us that he'd been on one of the largest nuclear-powered warships called the Carl Vinson. And he said, now the commander of the ship told me something, and then he said, oh, maybe he shouldn't have told me what he's. And then he said, off the record, George, will you turn off the tape? Because he knew I was recording, and I had to actually switch off the tape recorder on 3 occasions that night, because he wanted to tell us stuff that he wanted to tell us, but he wasn't prepared to be on record as saying that this is what happened. But all of that, it's really what he ended up telling us was basically the same as what's now everyone has now seen on that Tic Tac footage, that these large military ships are being surveyed by objects from the sky that come down and check them out, and they decommission the nuclear weapons that are on board. That's what they do. They do it on the bases on the ground as well.
Yeah.
They come in periodically and they just
disable
completely
them.
Neutralize our nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing.
Do you think it's possible we're being seeded with information? I mean, I'm an avid consumer of all kinds of information in my life. And one of the interesting things that I came across, obviously everybody knows John Glenn. What people don't know is that John Glenn was actually on Frasier for one episode. He was S himself, and he came on board to help Ross tape a documentary on the moon landings.
Oh, okay.
And then he starts talking about all the things he saw on it and how they were told they weren't allowed to talk about it.
Right.
But then they cut over to the conversation between Frasier and Ross. So you don't really hear everything he's saying.
You don't hear the end of it, yeah.
And then he goes, oh, I will need that tape. Thank you very much. You're taping this? I got to take it. Now, obviously, it's a humorous show. I get it. But in my opinion, I think sometimes the truth will just leak out of people.
Well, humor often has, jokes often have a lot of truth in them, don't they?
There's a kernel of truth, absolutely.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me at all. No, but I wasn't aware of that one. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So my question that I've been asking my friends is, how do you accept the information that you're now aware of with the Tic Tac UFO, having explained it to them, showed them the video, ensured they've consumed it, and had time to digest it and understand what it means? And then I asked them the question, well, how does that change your opinion towards UFOs and alien life, and do you think that we cohabitate the planet? You know, maybe they just arrived here after we started nuclear weaponing things, or maybe they've been here all the whole time. Maybe they are the Watchers, or maybe this is just a, one of those the rare planets that becomes like a shed house. You know, it's got everything you need on it. They can come here and live under the ocean. If they can travel through space, they can live under the ocean, surely. Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, I had a guy who wanted to report a UFO sighting, and it happened up in the Gulf of Carpentaria about a week before Cyclone Tracy went through and destroyed Darwin back then, 1974. And he was on night watch on a ship in the Gulf of Carpentaria, up there, up north. And he said that they saw what looked like a meteor going across, like a bolide, like a fireball going across the sky. He said, but then it did a U-turn and came towards the ship.
Goodness.
Which meteors don't do. And then it lost its fiery appearance, and it came down low to the water, and it went right past the ship. And he was on night duty, and he was on night guard. He watched it, and he said the strange thing about it was it was definitely a large object, and it was very large, and it was a disc, a flying disc. And he said the leading edge of it, which went all the way around it, he said it looked like it was ancient, and it would have been hammered by meteorites, because these things go through space. Obviously they're going to hit small meteorites.
Yeah, that's right.
He said this thing had looked like it was ancient, and it had been hammered by meteorites. He said it went past them slowly, and then it just dived down into the bottom of the sea.
Yeah.
So obviously if it can travel through space, it can travel underwater as well.
Yeah, I don't think there would be any environment it couldn't go through, whether because liquid is just particle, like air, or from space for that matter. If you're not propelling anything,
just a high density.
Yeah, that's it. And you don't know if they've come from a water world. It could just be liquid. I imagine there being, close to a sun, a world that is just liquid around a small dense rock.
Another interesting thing, there is an actual program called SETI, and it is run by NASA, and it is run from the Ames Research Center, which is part of NASA, and it's headed by Seth Shostak, who's one of the greatest skeptics.
Yes, Seth. Yep.
And he was on our Australian TV about 4 or 5 years ago. One morning I recorded it, probably 5 or 6 years ago, and he's saying that 1 in every 5 stars that we can see contains a solar system just like our sun, like a planetary system. He said 1 in 5. That's since been amended, but when he said that, he said we didn't know that 12 months ago. So they're now realizing that there is no missing matter in the universe. They used to say that 90% of the universe was missing. No, it's just that they couldn't see it, because they're all the planets that are around all the millions of stars. And then they're saying 1 in 3 stars has an entire solar system. So imagine all the billions and billions of lifelike planets that are just within the Milky Way galaxy, which we're on the outer end of the spiral arm of the Milky Way.
And there's the music. Thank you so much, George. It's awesome, Debbie. Maybe we can have you. I think maybe for 2 hours would be better, Dave.
Yeah.
But listenership, thank you very much for staying with us and for listening through. And I think Jerba is coming up
with his show After Hours. And this is Shiny Side Out with David Mackey, and tonight's guest has been George Simpson. We'll check you out next week, guys. Thank you so much. Take care.